All right, everyone. I thought I'll just give a brief intro, as many of you know that I do. So we're really happy to welcome today Ian Graham, who's going to be giving the Women's Health Seminar Series talk today. Before I introduce Ian, I'd like to recognize that we all live, work, and play in a community on unceded, ceded, and traditional territories of the 203 First Nations. Now, this is in Canada, and obviously I urge you to look at the communities that you may be involved with and live on the lands of in your countries. We acknowledge the importance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to action. And in all of the work, we're committed to ensuring Indigenous women's rights to health and safety and an equal opportunity to participate in a manner that recognizes and respects Indigenous cultures and traditions. Today, I myself am joining you from Vancouver, which is part of the unceded homelands of the Coast Salish peoples and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And this is the Women's Health Research Cluster. We have over 230 members. We run a number of events. We have a lot of collaborations and a lot of members from all, really across the world. That's really just centered on Canada there. If you'd like to become a member, please do so. It's quite easy to do so. And we do have a little bit of money to give out some trainee travel awards. And hint, right now we have a really good success rate. So if you want some travel award money, nobody's traveling right now, but there's certainly conference registration fees and things that people are still paying. So please do join. We couldn't do this without our sponsors, so we thank them very much for the money so that we can run these events. And for today's conversation, please, if you feel like it, tweet and tag us in your tweet about us. I'm going to stop sharing now and introduce Dr. Graham. It's really my pleasure. Dr. Graham is one of my favorite people in the world, even though I've only known him for a fairly short period of time, I'd say. So he is a professor in the School of Epidemiology and Public Health and a senior scientist at the Center for Practice-Changing Research at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. He is recognized as a pioneer in knowledge translation and implementation science. He's a co-originator of the Ottawa Model of Research Use, the Practice Guideline Evaluation and Adaptation Cycle, the Knowledge to Action Framework, and a founding member of the International ABA-PTE collaboration. He has published over 300 peer-reviewed articles and is co-editor of Knowledge Translation in Healthcare, that's 2013 second edition, and Knowledge Translation in Nursing and Healthcare and Implementation Roadmap in 2021. From 2006 to 2012, he was seconded to the position of Vice President of Knowledge Translation at CIHR. Ian is a member of the advisory board of CIHR Institute of Gender and Health, which is where I met him. His contributions to science have been recognized by his induction as a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, New York Academy of Science, and Royal Society of Canada. So numerous accolades. I could go on and on about Ian. I could also go on and on about how Ian's helped me reframe some of my thinking in a more coherent fashion. As many of you know, I always ask for a fun fact. And Ian's has got to be one of the best I've seen. So if you just bear with me, Ian is a descendant of convict stock. His third great-grandfather, Thomas West, was shipped to Australia in August 1800 for stealing, and he was then sentenced to life imprisonment. He was pardoned, though, on Christmas Eve in 1813 by Governor McQuarrie and was given a cow for good conduct. He was a miller and built a water mill that produced the first flour in Australia on July 12, 1812. That's pretty amazing fun fact. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Ian Graham. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for that very kind introduction. As I pull up the slides here, we'll get underway. So I do have a few disclosures. Lisa mentioned some of them. In particular, I want to thank the Institute for Gender and Health for providing some of the slides that I'm going to share with you. And so I think you need to know a little bit about me. So I did my PhD in sociology, medical sociology at McGill, and I focused on episiotomy. And I did a cross-national socio-historical analysis of what happened in the UK and the US between 1850 and the 1990s, looking at why episiotomy became routine practice in the US by 1950. And then by the 80s and 90s was being questioned, and the trials actually came out in the 80s and 90s showing that it wasn't beneficial, and then midwives and obstetricians stopped using it. And what I found out, and so essentially it was about knowledge, the thesis was about knowledge translation, but the term wasn't even used at that point when I was doing my thesis. And so it was about how obstetric practices become routine and challenged and then abandoned. And surprise, surprise, it had very little to do with evidence or science. So when the practice was embraced by the obstetrical community, there was not any good evidence that it was beneficial, and actually there was evidence that it was harmful, and they knew it was harmful, but they still thought that it was the right thing to do. And then when you move into the 80s and 90s, 1980s and 90s, when it was being questioned, it was women and childbirth educators and some healthcare providers, sympathetic ones, who were saying, what's the evidence for this? We need to be doing randomized controlled trials. But the rates of episiotomy already started to drop because of the questioning. So by the time the results of the trials came out, the practice had already changed, so that the research wasn't driving the practice. And that story, the story about episiotomy, was all about gender relations. So it was about childbearing women and their doctors, who tended to be men, and women midwives. And going back to the 1800s and early 1910s, they were immigrant women who had come to North America. And there was a whole drive, which you may or may not realize, by doctors to run them out of business, because they would go to a woman's house, be with them, attend the delivery, and then stay there and take care of the family for a week or two after the birth. And so they weren't paid very much, and women liked them because they actually spoke the same language, they knew how to cook the same food, all of those kinds of things. But for doctors who were trying to establish themselves as professions, these midwives were a direct threat to them. And so there's this whole discussion in the literature about how they were dirty, and you had to protect women against them and come to doctors because we're the ones who were going to save the world. So that was kind of my background getting into knowledge translation. So now I'd like you to tell me a little bit about you. So think about your knowledge of sex and gender, and would you say you're a novice, an intermediate, an expert? And when you think of knowledge translation or implementation science, the same thing. Do you think you're a novice, an intermediate, and an expert? And I can't seem to figure out now. Oh, there we go. I can now share the poll now that I figured out where it is. I'm launching the poll. And hopefully you can see this. I can only see part of it. So while you're working on that for a few seconds, in the 90s, I was asked to present at the Women's Study Group at McGill. And so I was very excited, and I went, and the room was filled. There's maybe 50 people. I was the only male in the room. And I was introduced, and I got up to the podium, and 3 women in the second row, right in front of me, stood up and said, "We object. Who do you think you are giving this presentation? And we do not think that you should be allowed to talk." And they kind of took me by surprise. And so I said, "Oh, is this because I'm a man?" And they said, "Yes." And so I said, "Okay, I kind of understand it. The story of episiotomy is about men, and what men have done have not been very good. But if men made the problem, maybe men should be part of the reconciliation if that's possible. But if you're concerned that because of my gender, I've biased, my analysis, then how about you listen to the talk, and then you can tell me where you see the bias, and I will try to deal with it." And then the moderator who had invited me got up and said, "Yeah, we've invited him, let him talk. And then at the end of the talk, if you're still not happy, you can beat him up then." So that was my first experience kind of with a hostile audience. And so the moral of that story is stay calm and be humble, and you may get out of it alive. So if we end the poll, so let's see, about 25% of people thought they were novice on the sex and gender piece, and then intermediate is the big group, and then, okay, about 8% feeling more expert on the KT side. Okay, so I have, not knowing what the group was going to be like, I've got more slides than I need, so I will adjust and we will skip things. And I don't know if the slides are going to be made available after or not, but they could be. So I need to set up a little bit of the story in terms around sex and gender and primary research before then looking at the considerations as it relates to knowledge translation and interdisciplinarity and implementation science. So hopefully I will, to some extent, get these three areas covered. So why does sex and gender matter? So we know that men and women and people of diverse gender are all equal, but when it comes to health and well-being, differences actually do make a difference, and they matter. And as you probably know, every cell is sexed, every person's gendered. These slides come from the Institute for Gender. So the notion of gender being all of the socially constructed roles and identities that we have versus sex, which is the biology, the DNA, the chromosomes, anatomy. So gender is important because it's relational, it intersects with other factors, it's non-binary, it's socially constructed, it changes over time. So this slide is in because I actually went to the Faculty of Medicine, sort of because I was on the advisory board for the Institute of Gender and Health, and said, we need to be doing something with our trainees to make sure that they understand, you know, the importance of including sex and gender in all of the science that they do, whatever science they do. And so the argument that actually convinced them was this one, that sex and gender is about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it's about the content, what we choose to study and how we choose to study it. So, you know, including both males and females and diverse groups need to be studied, and then disaggregating the data by sex and gender and actually reporting it and analyzing it so we can see if there are differences. If there's no differences, it doesn't matter, we can merge the data. But if you start with the merged data, then you don't know that maybe men are responding differently than women. But it's not just about the conduct of research, it's about who conducts research. And so is there diversity in terms of the groups in leadership positions? Are faculty and research teams diverse? Who actually has decision-making power on teams? So sex and gender integration in science, and I would say including knowledge translation and implementation science, leads to research outcomes that benefit everyone. So that's equity piece. So if you think of this in terms of inclusion, and then you need diversity in terms of the research questions, so variations in interests and perspective, and that leads to new discoveries. And then you need diversity in terms of research methods, so sex and gender-based analysis. You put those two together and you get more reproducible, transparent, and inclusive science. And why do we care? Because those scientific results then benefit all men and women and boys and girls and gender diverse people. And the virtual cycle starts over again. So increasingly, there has been emphasis on sex and gender in science and on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think we need to work really much harder to get these two in the same room talking to each other. And, you know, whether it's governments, funders, academic institutions, peer reviewers, journals, researchers, society in general, these are issues that should, you know, be important to us and matter and that we deal with. And you may or may not realize that CIHR is part of the health portfolio of the federal government. The sex and gender-based policy analysis goes back to 2009. I was at CIHR at the time. I was the executive corporate sponsor for the policy, which applied to anyone doing research or getting funding from CIHR, and for many years. And so the first step was to actually have the box that you tick off and have to explain how you're dealing with it, which is part of the application, but the peer reviewers never actually dealt with that until recently. They've been forced to actually comment on the adequacy of the response by the applicants to how are they going to deal with sex and gender. And then the Trudeau government in 2017 brought in the policy related to gender-based analysis plus. So it was getting into intersectionality, essentially. So this is CIHR. You can see expects that all research applicants will integrate gender and sex in their research designs when appropriate. And this was the compromise, the when appropriate, because it should be not when appropriate. You need to justify why it's not appropriate to do it. But this was the soft touch, to encourage people to move along with the times, as opposed to being more aggressive and forcing people to do something they don't necessarily want to. And so it's a long quote, but it's useful to, kind of get at. So that significant evidence to demonstrate that biological and social differences between men and women contribute to differences in health. Sex and gender influence our risk of developing certain diseases, how well we respond to medical treatments, how often we seek care, and I've added, and the effectiveness of research translation strategies to increase the use of research, accounting for sex and gender in health research, and its translation into practice and policy has the potential to make health research more rigorous, more reproducible, more applicable to everyone, and I've added, and more applied, which means you're going to get greater impact. So that's the kind of thesis that I want to have you take away. So in terms of expectations changing, we're in a really dynamic and interesting time related to this particular field. So funders like CIHR actually require researchers to talk about sex and gender in their applications. Peer reviewers at CIHR are now required to comment on it, and the scientific officer should have some note on it as well. And the nominated principal applicants are required for some of the special calls to actually do the training and have the certificate to be eligible to apply. And the plan is that anyone applying eventually to CIHR would have to have one of those certificates from one of the training modules. And all of the chairs and the scientific officers of the panels are supposed to have one of those certificates. Equity and research reporting guidelines, which you can see on the side there.
Oh, shoot. I think he's cutting out. Is he cutting out for other people too? Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. The joys of Zoom. So this is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors that are actually saying that medical journals who are publishing your articles should be paying attention to sex and gender and reporting it and disaggregating the findings and discussing the effects. So this is what the journals are actually getting these messages. So when we think about primary research and the need to consider sex and gender, the 4 bullets are the 4 themes or pillars of CIHR: basic or fundamental research, clinical health services, and population health. And, the standard thing is we need to pay attention to sex and gender because it goes to the quality of the science that we're funding and that we're doing and that we are reporting. So the challenge is, why is this an issue? Well, 80% of research that's on cells uses a male cell line or don't report it, which probably means they're using male cell lines. 75% of the animals that are used in research are male animals. 3/4 of the participants in human clinical trials are men, yet women consume and use more health services than men. And drugs, practices, procedures are not being tested on them at the same rates in general as they are for men. And I just shared an abstract of a paper, which is a protocol. And the issue is there are some drugs and technologies that have been tested only in men that are now being used in women. And some researchers are saying they need to be tested in women now. And there's an ethical dilemma with, but you would be denying people the standard of care. And it's like, but the standard of care wasn't actually tested on women to begin with. So maybe we do need to test it. And that was an argument in the 80s for not doing episiotomy trials, because it was women would avoid an episiotomy or avoid a tear, which was to do an episiotomy. And the physicians of the day said, no, you can't deny women episiotomies because we know they're really beneficial. Although we don't have any evidence for that, we do it routinely, so it has to be beneficial. So it's an interesting kind of ethical question of how to deal with this. But this is the data to show that why is it important that we pay attention to sex and gender in research. I don't know if you've seen this. It's a cute little infographic that is all about COVID and COVID research that the Institute for Gender and Health put out. And all of the areas that we should be considering: molecular mechanisms of viral pathogenesis, host immune response, diagnostic tests and serologic antibody testing, vaccines and therapeutics, clinical trials, medical devices and personal protective equipment. All of these things could be different if you looked at it and took into account sex and gender. Mental health, implementation science, policy. We'll just focus on the implementation science. Sex and gender and other identity characteristics influence the ways in which an implementation strategy works for whom, under what circumstances, and why. Messaging should consider how to appropriately include and target different groups according to sex, gender, and other identity characteristics. And if you think, and we know this increasingly, all of the policy implications, if you're not taking into account sex and gender and other intersectional characteristics, how individuals are, how the policies actually affect the lives of different individuals and categories and groups are hugely different. Another example of why it's important to consider it. So these are the 3 modules, and we have another poll, which is, let me pull it up. Okay, relaunch polling. That's not the one that I want. Let's end that one. Share the results. Okay, now stop sharing the results. Move on to the second one. You can see I do this a lot. Okay, there we go. Launch the poll. How exciting is that? Okay, I need to, and I figured out early on that I kind of need a story while you're doing this, because otherwise it's dead space and everybody feels uncomfortable. So I was mentioning that I went to the Faculty of Medicine. So I actually convinced them that all graduate students in the Faculty of Medicine needed to do one of these. And so now all of the master's students are having to do them, and all of the PhDs and postdocs. I'm not sure we have a good system for determining if that's actually happened or not, but they're getting it in different courses, that these are requirements that they have. So I'll just stop the polling and share it. So I think you can see that. So I was being a little bit tricky on the KT side. So the 22 people who said they intend to complete one. So we've really got good evidence that by getting someone to commit, they're much more likely to follow through. So there's 14 of you that you think about that now. I will be really disappointed if you don't go on at some point and do one of the modules. Okay, so knowledge translation. Let's shift gears now. And so some of you, this is more new to you. Others are more seasoned with it. This is CIHR's definition. It's actually part of CIHR's mandate, knowledge translation. So dynamic and iterative process that includes synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge. And this is the act, the CIHR Act, what CIHR is supposed to do. improve the health of Canadians, provide more effective health services and products, and a strengthened healthcare system. So synthesis is, how do you aggregate all of the global literature so that you actually know whether something works or doesn't work? So being cautious about the results of an individual study may not be stable. You may just get them by error. Dissemination is the kind of typical, how do you get the information out? You've done your study, you need to get it out. Exchange, knowledge exchange, is around, there are people who use the research and people who use it, and let's get them together, talk to each other. And then CIHR's definition is the only one in the world that has ethics in it, ethically sound application. And so application is the uptake of the research. So it might be that it informs future research. It might increase awareness of the new knowledge. It might be to change clinical practice. It might be to inform policy, for example. It might be to create new products and services that could be marketed. So I just want to spend a second on the ethical piece. And so all research that's funded by CIHR is by definition ethical, because if you involve humans, you must have REB approval or you can't actually do the study. So we're not concerned about the ethics of the research that's been conducted. I'm talking here about what do we do with the findings now that we have them. And these are 4 ways that ethics come into the uptake or application of research. There's opportunity costs. There's always more we could implement than we have money to implement. And so that means if we can only implement one thing and we've got 2 or 3 or 4, the others are equally as effective, that means somebody's going to be denied. And so in healthcare, let's say it's a new medication, we can only afford to fund one of them. So the people with the conditions for those other drugs are not going to get them, right? So we need to always remember when it comes to implementation or knowledge translation, there are opportunity costs. The implementation strategies, so how do we influence, convince, support people to use the new research, needs to be consistent with the norms and values of their context. So if we were in the military, and if I were the general, I could be coercive and say, you're going to do it, and I'm going to throw you in jail if you don't do it. That's not going to work in other contexts, right? That aren't hierarchical in that kind of way. So you could run into situations where I think I'm going to use more coercive approaches to get you to change your behavior, which may not be appropriate. The benefits of implementation should outweigh the harms. So CIHR, a national funder. Somebody's developed a new drug. The new drug is 2% better than the existing drug, but 20 times more expensive. So from the company's perspective, they have every right to market it and try to get people to use their drug, even though it's only a 2% improvement over the existing drug, and it's way more expensive. So as a society or as decision makers, sometimes you'll be confronted with, well, yes, there is evidence, and yes, it could be beneficial, but is it really worth implementing? And we don't want to implement if it costs us more to implement than the benefits we get out of implementing something. And then the last point, what is implemented may benefit some more than others, thereby creating inequities or increasing inequities, right? So that research that only includes men and shows that the drug works for men, they don't know that in fact it doesn't work as well with women, or women may react to it differently and so they don't get the full benefit. But if that then becomes the standard, it means that men getting the drug will actually do better than women getting the drug. So we've created inequities that probably we should be paying attention to. So think of knowledge translation as 2 big components. So there's the practice of knowledge translation or implementation, so the doing of it. And so the World Health Organization talks about the no-do gap. What do we know from the evidence from the literature, and what do we do? And we need the 2 to become aligned. So they talk about the no-do gap or the evidence practice gap and the need to reduce that. Making users aware of knowledge and facilitating their use of it to improve health and healthcare systems. Or another way of thinking about it is transforming evidence into policy or practice, or moving knowledge into action. So that was the practice of knowledge translation. There's also the science of knowledge translation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So this little graphic, on the left, you've got outputs. On the right, you've got impacts. Knowledge translation and practice is the bridge between the two, or as the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research refers to it, it's the pathway to impact. Having findings in a journal somewhere is not going to change the world. Very, very seldom does that ever happen. Somebody needs to do something to make that change happen. So KT is about making that difference. Okay, so 3 more categories of things related to knowledge translation. So end of grant knowledge translation or dissemination, like how do you get the information out? Kind of simple, straightforward. Implementation science or KT science. And then the third category is integrated knowledge translation. And I hope I will be able to get to that one, because that's what I'm particularly interested in at the moment. So if we think of the end of grant, Jonathan Lomas came up with this taxonomy. So let it happen. Diffusion. You publish it, you hope people will find the paper, make use of it. Help it happen is really the better definition of dissemination. So you know who the audience is, you know what the message is, and you target the audience with an appropriate medium. Doesn't mean they're going to read it. They may not pay any attention to it, but you're at least getting it to the right people in a format and in a vehicle that works for them. And then the third kind of category, which is labor intensive, is application or implementation, making it happen. What more do you need to do to actually, and usually there's all sorts of barriers that you need to attend to in order for people to be able to use the research and change their practice or policy. So judicious knowledge translation or dissemination or application. So keep in mind, decisions about the extent and ambitiousness of your KT plan should be guided by things like the reliability, the validity, the strength, and the significance of the findings. In some cases, maybe all you need to do is publish. I would also add to that list, the inclusion of sex and gender considerations is probably something that you should be paying attention to. So we want to be wary of single small studies, poor methodological quality, low strength of evidence, ones that don't disaggregate data by sex and gender when that's an appropriate thing to do. And likely we should be thinking about the unit of knowledge translation being knowledge synthesis, as opposed to the individual study, although there are exceptions where, the clinical trial done in 30 countries with 200,000 people is never going to be replicated, and I'm quite happy to go with that. But other studies where it's, 30 people, probably we need to replicate that. So from a knowledge translation perspective, if the primary research, so the original research, doesn't consider sex and gender, should we be concerned about the dissemination and uptake of that research? So for example, if it's basic research that uses cell lines from only one sex, or preclinical trials that only use animals from one sex, or clinical trials of drugs and procedures using unrepresentative samples, or post-marketing surveillance studies that don't examine drug effects in all of the population segments, or patient-oriented or comparative effectiveness research that doesn't consider sex and gender, or even systematic reviews that don't consider sex and gender in their analysis. So how worried should we be about this research now, thinking about our goal is to try to implement these findings and get people to change their decision-making, alter their behavior? So we'll try, this is the last poll, I think. So from a knowledge user perspective, if the primary research does not consider sex and gender, how concerned would you be about its dissemination creating potential health inequities? Not concerned, somewhat concerned, definitely concerned, or not sure. And let's see. Oh my God, how slick was that? Third time, right, go. Oh, definitely concerned. Way out in front. So we've got 75% of people polled. So I think we'll stop it. I'll share the results so you can see the vast majority of you said you would be definitely concerned. And actually, this is all about equity, right? This is about who's benefiting and how much are they benefiting, and is that creating inequities between groups. So let's move on to implementation science, or KT science. So this is the scientific study of the methods to promote the uptake of research findings into routine clinical care, organizational and policy context. So this is the definition from the journal Implementation Science. You can see that it focuses on health. If Shirk uses the term knowledge mobilization, and so they wouldn't have these clinical contexts, but it's exactly the same concept. So understanding, so what is studied in implementation science? So the determinants of knowledge use or decision making, what influences why we make the decisions that we make. And lots of studies are about the effectiveness of methods or interventions to promote the uptake of the new knowledge or behavior change, right? So answering questions about how do we promote the uptake of effective practice and abandon ineffective ones? It's not always implementation, as in the episiotomy case, it could be about de-implementation. The field is theoretically pluralistic and uses mixed methods, and strong social and behavioral science influence on the field. Not surprising, because it's all about people and how to help them make better use of research findings. So a few years ago, 4 years, 5 years now, Kara Tenenbaum is the scientific director of the Institute for Gender and Health. I think it was about 2015. She held a conference. Lorraine Greaves, who's from BC, was there. I was there. We gave different talks around implementation, and this paper came out of, it was one of the outputs of that conference. And nobody to this point had actually been explicit about, well, why should we be concerned about sex and gender in implementation research? And here are some of the reasons. So sex and gender can be very important in decision making. So for example, we know boards of companies, if they have a higher proportion of women on those boards, they are less, they make less risky decisions, and they care more about their employees. If there's more men on the board, they are more likely to make riskier decisions and are less concerned about the well-being of the organization. Gross generalizations, but at that level, we know that gender actually plays a factor in how the board functions and what it's prepared to accept in terms of risk level. Communication and communication styles, stakeholder engagement, recipients' preferences for implementation strategies. And so think about advertising, right? Companies have figured out how to get the attention of market segments, whether that's gender or ethnicity or whatever. They think this way. How do you divide up your population so that you can better tailor your message to them? Ultimately, in their case, they want you to buy their product. And so that's what their impact is. In our world, it's about, are the research findings being used? Is it informing policy? Is it informing clinical practice? Is it informing patients' decision-making processes? All of these things are aspects of knowledge translation. So the ways implementation strategies work, for whom and under what circumstances and why, are always influenced by gender roles, identity, relations, and institutionalized gender. And because I'm running out of time, I'll refer you to the paper. The link is there. But we have this table that's a really nice one because it goes through each of them. So it gives the definition of what a gender role is. And then that third column is actually about what would be an implementation science research question. And then the fourth column is, well, what's the practical implication for someone wanting to implement or do knowledge translation? And then the last column are examples of potential measures that might be relevant. So gender roles, sorry for, this is really sensitive. Gender relations and institutionalized gender. But actually, we're realizing that sex and gender is not enough. We need to move beyond that, and that gender is actually structured by and operates through progress, which I'm not sure, I have another slide in a minute where we'll go through it, but it's essentially the intersectionality characteristics. And so progress and progress plus actually comes from the Cochrane Methods Equity Group. And so progress stands for place of residence, race, ethnicity, culture and language, occupation, gender and sex, religion, education, socioeconomic status, social capital, and then the plus, personal characteristics associated with discrimination, features of relationships, time-dependent relationships. And so that's the way that Cochrane Group actually bring in kind of these intersections. And then Sharon Strauss and the Knowledge Translation Program at St. Mike's Hospital in Toronto actually has a huge project on approaching knowledge translation with an intersectional lens. And so I have the next slide is about this flower. But it's a good place to start looking if you're wanting more information about intersectionality, sex and gender, and knowledge translation. And so the flower, the petals of the flower are all about identity, right? So place of residence, racialization, occupation, religion, education, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, and then social capital. And what you see around the outside are many of the common forms of discrimination that people encounter because of their identities and how groups respond to these, social roles and expectations. The Institute for Gender and Health 3 or 4 years ago now actually had a competition. They wanted more research and they wanted teams to focus on the impact of gender on knowledge translation. 5 teams were funded. You'll notice that Lorraine is the third one down, integrating and measuring the effect of sex, gender, and gender transformative. That one. The first one is at the Ottawa Hospital, where I'm at the Research Institute, and it's absolutely brilliant. So in surgery, they are now using what's called the black box. So it's the same thing as pilots. So everything in the operating room is videotaped from multiple angles with sound. So they can actually analyze exactly what happened when it happened during surgery. And so they're able to actually look at the sex and gender things that happen on the surgical team. And then I'll just draw your attention to the last one, which is Sharon is the PI. I'm actually on this one, transforming the practice of KT and embedding gender. And last year, these 5 teams came together to actually talk about issues around sex and gender and KT, and have published a paper this year, or 2020, in Health Research and Policy Systems. And this is just to give you a flavor. So Sharon Strauss's team, Dr. Nicole Etherington, has led this project. So has taken the theoretical domains framework. So this is a framework that's based on 30 psychological theories that you can use to interview someone about the factors that may be influencing their decision to change their behavior or not. Those 30 psychological theories, most of them or all of them didn't actually consider sex and gender. And so this paper is a process, goes through a process of how you can take a theory or framework in KT, apply an intersectionality lens, and in this case, how would that interview guide based on the theoretical domains framework actually look different if you were also probing sex and gender and other intersectionality aspects? So a really good paper that I would suggest you look at. France Laguerre's team was also one of the other teams above that got funding. So they did a systematic review of sex and gender considerations in implementation interventions to promote shared decision-making. I forgot how many studies they included, but 2/3 of the studies. So these were studies around implementing an intervention to get typically patients and clinicians to do shared decision-making. 2/3 of the studies didn't report on sex and gender. So we have no idea who the people were, the clinicians or the patients, in terms of sex and gender. Of the 2/3 that did report on it, they then showed, as we know from many studies, great confusion by the authors in terms of what's sex and what's gender, and getting them confused and calling gender, labeling something gender that in fact is sex. So within the knowledge translation literature, this paper shows that the same problems that's in the wider literature of we need definitions, we need people to use them in a standard fashion still apply in the field of knowledge translation. So integrated knowledge translation, a model of collaborative research where researchers work with knowledge users to identify a problem and are in a position to act on the research findings. The underlying theory is essentially co-production. Researchers have their own worldview, they have their own culture, they have their own timeline, they emphasize certain things. Knowledge users, be they patients or clinicians or managers or policymakers, they have different cultures, different languages, different time frames for making decisions. The problem, or the reason research doesn't get into practice and policy, is these two worlds never collide. So integrated knowledge translation is, let's bring them together and do research collectively, and maybe that will help break the divide. So a way of thinking, so it's not a methodology at all, but it is an approach or a way of thinking about conducting research to make the results more applicable to the study population. And it's a paradigm shift focused on engagement. And depending on where you are and what discipline and field and country, it may be labeled collaborative research or participatory research or action-oriented community-based research, engaged scholarship. Mode 2 knowledge production is more common in the UK. Research co-production or creation of knowledge. All of these are way more similar than they are different. And the moniker is essentially nothing about me without me. And those end users, so we've got researchers, and who are they working with? Well, they can be policymakers and decision makers from the community, any level, patients, providers, industry, health system managers. In the case of Indigenous health research, it's the whole community is actually the partner with the researcher. So we don't really pay enough attention, or haven't, within this area of research co-production around issues of the gender of researchers, the gender of knowledge users and their interactions, and more than gender, those intersectional characteristics. So do some researchers, scientists, have preferences for working in a collaborative way that could be related to gender? Are there gender differences in who wants to be a knowledge user partner? How does gender and sex affect the collaboration and the interactions, right? It's all relational, right? We're working together in partnership. So does it matter what your sex and gender are of this group, your team? And then coming back, I mentioned it before, who's really got the decision-making power? With an integrated or research co-production, we're equal partners, right? And so we need to work together. It's not researchers calling all of the shots. We're working together, addressing the issues and concerns of the knowledge user throughout the research process. So I know you're not supposed to present tables. This is from the KT evaluation at CIHR. And I want you to focus down on the bottom where it says gender, sex in the OGP. OGP is what's currently called the program scheme, or the project scheme, or the project program. And so there's confusion at CIHR about, is it sex or is it gender? I think we're talking about gender here, but synthesis is the competition. So 57% of the women who got funding from the synthesis competition, which required knowledge users to be co-applicants, right? So it's the team working together. 57% were women. Knowledge to action, same thing, 2-year grants had to have knowledge users as co-applicants. 68% of the PIs were women. FISI, Partnership for Health System Improvement, 57% were women. KT Science, that's in the open grants competition. So that's a regular panel, and it's nearly 50-50. 52% PI were women compared to 48% were men. KTS is knowledge translation supplement. So after you got your grant, you could come back to CIHR, say how you wanted to disseminate your findings. 70% were women who got those grants. DE is dissemination events, and it's 56%. So in total, 58% of the integrated KT, or the KT grants at CIHR, were going to women as PIs. 30% of the applicants in the program stream, the PIs were women. So a lot more, right? A lot more women actually doing KT and doing integrated KT. If you look to the panel above it around research experience, it also shows that the women doing the KT were much more likely to be early career, 0 to 5, 21% compared to 2% of people in the open are under 5 years. And we know that it's hard to break in. CIHR, after I left, held on to the report, this report, and the president at the time, Dr. Baudet, didn't appreciate knowledge translation, and he committed $10 million increase to the program stream every year. Guess what? These KT funding opportunities were 10 million. So the decision was made they were going to get rid of these KT programs, put the money into the open, and we'll call it integration. Well, a lot of women researchers were adversely affected by this decision because their source, like they were very successful in these competitions. And I don't know whether it's because they were more likely to apply to the competition than men, or when men applied, they were just not as good as the women. Either way, this was an important source of funding for women that was taken away from them. So in summary, we need to consider sex, gender, and intersectionality of all health in all health research, including knowledge translation, is becoming increasingly recognized by research funders and journal editors. When primary research fails to consider sex and gender and intersectionality, it raises ethical questions about how strongly this knowledge should be disseminated and used. And if it is used, we need to be thinking about the potential for creating or widening health inequities. Sex and gender and intersectionality considerations should apply to all knowledge translation and implementation science until we actually have evidence that sex and gender and intersectionality doesn't matter. So we should assume that until we have the evidence to say it doesn't matter, we should assume that it might matter and consider it. Failing to consider sex, gender, and intersectionality in knowledge translation has the potential to create, magnify, reinforce inequities in health and well-being, and this makes it an ethical imperative to incorporate gender-based analysis in KT and science. I can take a breath. So, really sorry for being dropped out there.
Well, thank you so much to Ian. I know there's 3 minutes left though, and there were quite a few questions in the chat. So thank you so much. As you can do your clap emojis. You might have seen me looking down. I was trying to tweet like a mad woman, and I was only successful for some of the tweets, but some really great papers and wisdom that you shared, of course, with us, Ian. And I have so many questions, but it's not about me. Darn it! I like it when it's about me. It's about everyone else. So I'm going to try to get us through many questions. We might go a couple of minutes over, but obviously if you have to leave, just leave. Let's see. Yeah, okay, so there's some comments and things like that. I'm wondering if, the implementation of, this is kind of going back to basics, but the implementation of sex and gender in the research itself, which I know we are talking about this knowledge generation, how can we improve it? Like, shouldn't we be sort of thinking about, like you said something early on about EDI. What worked with one group was talking about EDI, and then all of a sudden it sort of clicked with them that this is an important piece of work. What group was that again? And can you think, is there ways that we can work to engage people more?
Yeah, so that was the Dean of Medicine and the executive group. And of course, they are wanting to pay a lot of attention because there's been so many issues coming up increasingly and continuously. So I think what the field needs to do is actually think about implementation science in terms of how do we bring this information about the importance of sex and gender and intersectionality to researchers, and all of the things I said still apply. So it's about segmenting it. So will basic scientists respond to different messages from population health researchers?
That's exactly what I've been thinking we need. Like,
there you go. I'm on board. Sign me up.
Okay, good. Because I think there's just so many things being thrown out, and it's really hard to pinpoint where the pressure points are for people in terms of their sort of lack of integration of SGBA. There's also, could the references be shared? And I did try to tweet some of them, but I mean, I guess Susanna asked that question, but yes, I mean, of course, there's going to be a recording, and Ian has graciously agreed that it can be put on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to see the references from there anyway. But I guess Ian,
I can create a list of the references, and you can share them.
Okay, thank you. I'm thinking about something else, but like a blog or something, but a list of references would be great. That's more work to do a blog, but I everyone, anybody else that wants to ask a question, you can probably also unmute yourself if you want. We'll just go on for about another minute or so. But yeah, I think that there's just so much richness in what you talked about in terms of things that I obviously don't think about in my own basic science pillar one realm, and sorry to the Americans on the call there are a few Americans on the call that will be working more within the NIH framework, but so pillar one's like the biomedical sort of pillar, so and if we don't talk to each other, we don't know what the different issues and how we can push through those barriers. So I think that's really important. Suzanne just made the comment that thank you for your work around episiotomies. It's so important, and absolutely, we've had a couple of conversations, Ian and I, about episiotomies when we're in those advisory meetings. And Veronica asks, I struggle with the application of sex and gender and intersectionality in KT. Do you have any practical advice?
Well, it is hard, and we don't have enough people who are actually thinking through these issues, right? So my advice is think about your project, think of it very broadly in terms of, well, where might sex and gender and other intersectional, aspects or characteristics be potentially important? And I don't think we should be beating ourselves up about not getting it 100% right to begin with. Nobody has been doing this, right? So there are no models to look at. There's frameworks in the sex and gender and intersectionality world around that. There's KT frameworks. I showed you the one from Nicole Etherington, where it's trying to bring the two together on the framework side. But in terms of actually doing it in practice, there's not a lot of examples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's not even a lot, sometimes we have debates about what's the best way to even study sex and gender. And I know IGH has put out a Meet the Methods series, and even the first one that they put out, I thought was really good, but I had some issues with the methods that were, oh, well, that works for this, but it doesn't work for that. So even when we don't have complete consensus on the method or the measures that we use, that also doesn't always help the situation, makes it more challenging.
the other thing that's really exciting, I think, are our trainees. So they are much more attuned to the issues of sex and gender and intersectionality. Some of them are catching on to KT and seeing how that might be an exciting field that maybe they haven't gone into before. So I think in some ways, it's going to be the trainees and early career researchers who are going to lead the old fogies like me.
No, I completely agree. I will. There's a great question from Jillian that I'll ask, and that'll be the last one. But the one thing I'll say is that some trainees have come up to me saying that they really want to do it, but the one barrier they have, major barrier they have, is their supervisor won't let them do it. So I'm sure that isn't very helpful for future endeavors in SGBA. Let me just ask a question from Jillian Hanley. I'm wondering about your thoughts about how we might be or are missing opportunities for improving diversity in research team at the training stage. It seems to me that we have a lot of work to do at the level of how we select and fund trainees. Totally agree. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's $1 million question. And I think we need to be thinking like at the graduate level, our programs. I was reading an article this morning, right? Less than 25% people who go on to get PhDs actually get tenure track positions. And yet the model for the PhD is we're training academics, right? So I think it's layered all the way through that we need to kind of look at the curriculum and think about things completely different and focus on interdisciplinary team sports, because that's part of what this is, paying attention to diversity and inclusion. And so that we're actually, our training models are paying attention to that. Like it wasn't that long ago, it wasn't about trainees. It was maybe 5 years ago, I was in a room with the executive of a research team. And I was the one, it was a medical team. I was the non-physician. And I said, why are there no women here? And they said, well, our field isn't very big. And I said, well, Canada is. Like, there's no women in this area anywhere in the country. And they hadn't thought about it. Like, so a little bit of work to do on that. I see the question about EDI captured in SGBA. It's not captured in sex and gender-based analysis, but it is captured in the gender-based analysis plus. The second policy that I put up from the government of Canada, that one includes intersectionality aspects.
All right, Ian, just in the interest of time, like I could talk to you all afternoon. There are like many other great questions throughout the chat. I can't even keep up, and I'm supposed to be the moderator, and I'm not doing a very good job. But I just want to thank the people that stayed on the line, first of all, and just thank you again for an excellent talk. And thank you again. I'm sure he'll send the references. If not, I'll keep pestering him and remind him of his convict heritage.
That's right. Make me feel bad.
No, I love Australia, and everybody deserves a second chance.
Yeah.
Right.
And you might get a cow.
And you might get a cow and produce flour. I mean, it was in short supply. Anyway, thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to Ian again for a wonderful talk, very thought-provoking. And clearly we have a lot more work to do, and a lot more trainees that can help us along the way. So thank you.
Okay.